What the research actually shows. There's a bottle in most kitchens that gets treated like an afterthought, something you grab on your way to the stove, pour without thinking, and forget about the moment the pan starts to sizzle. But if you look at the last 30 years of nutrition research, extra virgin olive oil keeps showing up in a very different role. Not as a garnish, not as background flavor, as one of the most heavily studied foods in the entire field of human nutrition. That's not an exaggeration. Olive oil sits at the center of some of the largest, longest, and most carefully designed dietary studies ever conducted. And what researchers have found isn't a miracle. It isn't a cure. It's something rarer and, honestly, more useful than either of those things. A genuinely strong, replicated body of evidence. So let's slow down and go through what the science actually shows, where it's rock solid, where it's promising but early, and where it simply doesn't say what a lot of headlines claim it says. Olive oil has been part of Mediterranean diets for thousands of years, but the scientific spotlight really turned toward it in the mid-20th century when researchers noticed something curious. Populations living around the Mediterranean, in places like Crete, southern Italy, and coastal Spain, had dramatically lower rates of heart disease than populations in Northern Europe or the United States, despite diets that weren't especially low in fat. That observation launched decades of research trying to figure out why. Over time, the pattern narrowed. It wasn't just a Mediterranean diet. It was specifically a diet built around vegetables, legumes, whole grains, fish, and running through nearly everything. Olive oil as the primary source of fat, replacing butter and other saturated fats almost entirely. That's the context to keep in mind for everything that follows. Olive oil's health story isn't really about a bottle sitting alone on a shelf. It's about what happens when it replaces something less healthy in your everyday meals. If there's one area where the science is genuinely settled, it's cardiovascular health. The clearest evidence comes from the Bedtime trial, one of the largest dietary intervention studies ever conducted. Researchers followed thousands of people in Spain who were at high risk for cardiovascular disease, assigning them either to a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, a Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts, or a lower-fat control diet. The results showed a meaningful reduction in major cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular death in the olive oil group compared to the control group. This wasn't a small observational study where researchers just watched what people ate and drew conclusions. It was an actual controlled trial, which carries far more weight in nutrition science, where controlled trials are notoriously difficult and expensive to run. Part of the explanation seems to come down to what olive oil is actually made of. It's roughly 3/4 oleic acid, a monounsaturated fat. Oleic acid appears to help protect LDL cholesterol, what people often call bad cholesterol, from a process called oxidation, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. LDL cholesterol on its own isn't necessarily dangerous. It's oxidized LDL that tends to embed itself in artery walls and contribute to the buildup of plaque. Several studies have found that regular olive oil consumption is associated with lower markers of LDL oxidation, which lines up neatly with the reduced cardiovascular events seen in the larger trials. None of this means olive oil is a replacement for cardiovascular medication, and no legitimate researcher would suggest skipping a statin or blood pressure medication in favor of a salad dressing. What the evidence supports is something more modest and, frankly, more believable. As part of an overall diet, olive oil appears to meaningfully lower cardiovascular risk over years and decades. One of the more interesting stories in this whole field is how researchers first identified one of olive oil's key compounds. Back in 2005, a group of researchers noticed something odd. High-quality, freshly pressed, extra virgin olive oil produces a distinct peppery, throat-catching sensation, the kind of sharp bite you sometimes notice at the back of your throat when you taste a really good oil. One of the scientists happened to recognize that sensation. It reminded her of the exact same throat-catching feeling produced by liquid ibuprofen. That observation led to a genuine discovery. The compound responsible for that peppery bite is called oleocanthal, and it turns out to inhibit some of the same inflammatory pathways, the COX1 and COX2 enzymes, that ibuprofen targets. It's a much weaker effect than the medication itself, but it's a real and measurable one, and it's been replicated in follow-up research since. This matters because chronic, low-grade inflammation is increasingly understood as a contributing factor in a wide range of conditions associated with aging, from cardiovascular disease to joint deterioration to some forms of cognitive decline. A food that naturally contains a mild anti-inflammatory compound, consumed regularly as part of the diet, is a genuinely interesting piece of that larger puzzle. To be clear, oleocanthal is not a substitute for anti-inflammatory medication, and nobody should adjust a treatment plan based on a spoonful of olive oil, but it does help explain, mechanistically, why regular olive oil consumption tends to show up in blood tests as lower systemic inflammation across many different studies. Beyond oleocanthal, olive oil contains a range of other polyphenols, plant compounds like hydroxytyrosol and oleuropein, that behave in an interesting way inside the digestive system. Rather than being absorbed early in the small intestine, a meaningful portion of these compounds travels intact all the way to the large intestine. Once there, research suggests they act somewhat like a prebiotic, supporting the growth of certain beneficial bacterial species while making conditions less favorable for some less beneficial ones. A healthier, more diverse gut microbiome has been linked in observational research to better immune regulation, improved metabolic health, and lower systemic inflammation. It's worth being honest that this is a newer and less settled area of nutrition science than the cardiovascular research. Gut microbiome studies are notoriously difficult to compare across populations because diet, genetics, medication use, and countless other factors all shape the microbiome simultaneously. So while the polyphenol and gut bacteria connection is a real and active area of research, it deserves a more cautious, promising label rather than a proven one. There's also reasonably solid evidence around blood sugar regulation. Several studies have found that adding olive oil to a carbohydrate-containing meal slows gastric emptying, meaning food leaves the stomach more gradually, which in turn blunts the blood sugar spike that typically follows eating. For people managing insulin resistance or prediabetes, this kind of modest meal-by-meal effect can add up meaningfully over time. It's a modifier of the overall metabolic response to food, not a treatment for diabetes on its own. This is probably the area that generates the most public interest, and also the area where it's most important to be careful about what the evidence actually supports. Large, long-running observational studies have repeatedly found that people who closely follow a Mediterranean diet, the kind built around vegetables, fish, legumes, and olive oil as the primary fat, tend to have a lower risk of cognitive decline and dementia later in life compared to people who don't. Some of these studies have followed participants for over a decade, and the association shows up consistently across different populations and research groups. At the laboratory level, some studies using animal models have found that certain olive oil polyphenols may help reduce the accumulation of proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease and may support the brain's own waste-clearing processes during sleep. These are legitimate and actively researched mechanisms, but here's the important caveat. Most of the strongest human evidence in this area comes from studying dietary patterns as a whole, not from isolating olive oil by itself in a controlled trial specifically measuring cognitive outcomes. It's genuinely difficult to design a study that proves one single ingredient, on its own, prevents a disease that can take decades to develop. So while the Mediterranean diet and brain health connection is well supported, the more specific claim that olive oil alone, taken a certain way, directly protects against Alzheimer's is still an open and active research question rather than a settled fact. That distinction matters. It doesn't make the research less interesting. It just means the honest version of this story is highly promising, still developing, rather than solved. Because oleocanthal has real anti-inflammatory properties, some researchers have investigated whether regular olive oil consumption might help with symptoms of osteoarthritis, which involves inflammatory processes that break down joint cartilage over time. The research here does exist, and some smaller human trials have found modest improvements in pain and mobility scores among participants who consumed olive oil regularly. But this is one of the weaker parts of olive oil's overall evidence base, both because the trials tend to be smaller and because osteoarthritis has so many contributing factors: joint mechanics, body weight, genetics, prior injury, that isolating the effect of one food is especially difficult. It's a reasonable area of ongoing research, not a proven treatment. It's worth being just as clear about what isn't well supported as what is. There's no strong evidence that the specific time of day you consume olive oil changes its effects in any meaningful way. There's no solid research behind the idea of a precise protocol, a specific tablespoon count paired with a specific companion food, timed to a specific hour before sleep. Those kinds of detailed rituals tend to show up in health content because they sound authoritative and scientific, not because they're actually what the underlying studies tested. The real research is much simpler and honestly a little less exciting to describe. People who consistently include olive oil in their diet over years as a replacement for less healthy fats tend to show better long-term health outcomes across several major categories. That's a genuinely strong finding. It just doesn't need an invented ritual attached to it to be worth taking seriously. If you want to apply what the research supports, here's what's actually grounded in the evidence. The extra virgin designation means the oil was extracted mechanically, without heat or chemical processing, which preserves more of the polyphenols responsible for many of these effects. Refined or light olive oils go through more processing and tend to contain far fewer of these beneficial compounds. Olive oil isn't like wine. It doesn't improve with age. Polyphenol content degrades over time, and especially with exposure to light and heat. A dark glass bottle, stored in a cool cabinet away from the stove and used within a few months of opening, will retain more of its beneficial compounds than a bottle that's been sitting open on the counter for a year. That throat-catching sensation isn't a flaw. It's a rough indicator of oleocanthal content. Very mild, buttery-tasting oils often have lower polyphenol levels than oils with a noticeable peppery finish. The strongest evidence comes from studies where olive oil replaced less healthy fats, butter, margarine, or processed vegetable oils, rather than simply being added on top of an already existing diet. It's still a calorie-dense fat, so the health benefit comes largely from substitution, not from unlimited addition. If you're on blood thinners, cholesterol medication, or managing diabetes, it's worth mentioning any significant dietary change to whoever manages your treatment, not because olive oil is dangerous, but because any real shift in diet is worth having on record with your care team. It's worth pausing on this phrase because it gets used loosely in marketing, but has a precise meaning in the actual olive oil industry. Extra virgin refers to oil extracted purely through mechanical pressing, with no heat and no chemical solvents involved, and it must meet certain chemical thresholds for acidity and defects to earn that label. That matters for the research we've been discussing, because most of the studies showing cardiovascular, anti-inflammatory, and metabolic benefits used extra virgin oil specifically, not the more processed pure or light olive oils found on some supermarket shelves, which go through refining processes that strip out a large share of the polyphenol content. This is also where a lot of consumer confusion comes from. Olive oil mislabeling has been a documented problem in the industry for years, with some products labeled extra virgin not actually meeting the standard once tested. If you want the version of olive oil that's actually connected to the research, a few practical signs help. A harvest date on the bottle rather than just a vague expiration date. A dark or opaque container that blocks light, and ideally a specific country or region of origin rather than a vague blend. None of this is about brand snobbery. It's simply that the compounds responsible for many of these health effects are the first things lost when quality slips. A few claims about olive oil circulate widely enough that they're worth addressing directly because they tend to get in the way of people actually using it well. This isn't quite right. Extra virgin olive oil has a smoke point in the range most home cooking actually uses, which comfortably covers sautéing, roasting, and most stovetop cooking. High heat over extended periods does degrade some polyphenol content, so very high heat searing or deep frying isn't the ideal use case, but ordinary cooking is fine. This myth likely comes from confusing olive oil with more delicate oils that genuinely shouldn't be heated. Price is a weak indicator on its own. Some very good oils are moderately priced, and some expensive bottles are older or lower quality than their price suggests. Harvest date, packaging, and origin tend to be more reliable signals than price alone. Olive oil holds up well as an everyday cooking fat, not just a finishing touch. The idea that it should only be drizzled cold onto finished dishes undersells how it's actually used in the very Mediterranean diets the research is built around, where it's used throughout the cooking process, not sparingly at the end. As covered above, the research is specific to extra virgin oil, so a heavily refined, lower quality product won't necessarily deliver the same measured effects seen in these studies, even though it's still a reasonably healthy fat compared to many alternatives. It's worth briefly comparing where olive oil sits relative to other common fats, since a lot of its benefit in the research comes specifically from what it replaces. Compared to butter and other sources high in saturated fat, olive oil's profile, high in monounsaturated fat, with meaningful polyphenol content, is associated with more favorable cholesterol patterns in most controlled comparisons. Compared to many highly processed vegetable oils, and especially anything containing industrially produced trans fats, olive oil again tends to compare favorably in cardiovascular research, in large part because trans fats have such strong, well-established links to negative cardiovascular outcomes that almost anything compares well against them. Compared to other minimally processed plant fats, like avocado oil or the fat naturally found in nuts, olive oil isn't necessarily unique or superior across the board. Several of these share similar monounsaturated fat profiles and overlapping health associations. What sets olive oil apart in the research specifically is less about it being an isolated superfood and more about how deeply it's woven into the Mediterranean diet studies that produced some of the strongest, longest-running nutritional evidence available. In other words, much of what makes olive oil special in the research is inseparable from the overall pattern of eating it's typically part of. Olive oil doesn't need exaggerated claims, invented statistics, or fictional patient stories to be one of the better supported foods in nutrition science. It has decades of research behind it, including some of the largest controlled dietary trials ever conducted, a genuinely fascinating anti-inflammatory compound that was discovered almost by accident, and a well-established place at the center of the most studied dietary pattern in the world, The real story is quieter than the dramatic version. It's not about a secret nighttime ritual or a hidden miracle sitting in your cabinet. It's about a food with real, replicated evidence behind it, used consistently as part of an overall way of eating, and that, on its own, is worth paying attention to.